The sky above northern Germany burned white with contrails. It was February 1944, the heart of the air war over Europe. Inside a B-17 flying fortress, 20,000 feet above the frozen clouds, the air was thin, the noise deafening. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Gunners worked in oxygen masks stiff with frost, eyes narrowed behind glass sights. From the waist gun, Sergeant James Carter saw it, a blur rising fast from the clouds below. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, sunlight flashing off its wings, diving straight for the formation. His hands locked on the twin 50s. His heart raced. Instinct screamed one thing: aim at the plane. Fire where you see him. But Carter remembered the voice from training, calm, relentless, scientific. Don't aim at the target. Aim behind it. It made no sense then. It felt like suicide now. He led the sight just past the fighter's tail and squeezed the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, impact. The Bf-109 flew straight into the burst. A flash. A black spiral falling through the clouds. The impossible rule had worked again. Aim behind the enemy, and you hit him square. In the early years of America's air war over Europe, courage alone wasn't enough to stay alive. When the 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing campaign, in 1942, its leaders promised precision strikes that would cripple Germany's war machine. They sent armadas of B-17s and B-24s across the English Channel, each bristling with machine guns, each manned by 10 young Americans. But in those first months, the dream of precision met the brutal truth of physics. The Luftwaffe was faster, better organized, and mercilessly efficient. Me-109s and FW-190s slashed through bomber formations like hawks through flocks of doves. Even with 12.50 caliber guns per aircraft, the fortresses were losing men faster than they could be replaced. Crews fired thousands of rounds in every engagement, yet the enemy kept coming. After-action reports revealed a shocking statistic. In 1942 and early 1943, American bomber gunners averaged over 12,000 rounds per confirmed kill. Entire ammunition belts vanished into empty sky. Gunners were aiming with courage, but not with accuracy. The reason was simple and deadly. Humans were never built to fight in 3 dimensions. From a turret at 25,000 feet, nothing stayed still. Both the shooter and the target were moving, often at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. To hit anything at that velocity, one had to anticipate, not react. A gunner's eyes saw where the fighter was, but by the time his finger pulled the trigger, the target had already moved hundreds of feet ahead. The bullets arrived where the enemy used to be. Instinct, the same force that once kept men alive on the ground, now betrayed them in the air. Commanders in England began to realize that bravery and firepower alone would never balance the equation. The missing weapon wasn't steel. It was understanding. The answer would come not from generals or pilots, but from physicists, engineers, and psychologists, men who studied how the brain misjudged motion and how machines could correct it. Across the Atlantic, in gunnery schools stretching from Tyndall Field, Florida, to Harlingen, Texas, a quiet scientific revolution was beginning. Here, recruits were taught not how to aim, but how to predict. They were told that survival depended on rejecting instinct itself. Deflection-shooting, the principle of firing ahead of where the target would be, became the gospel of aerial defense. It sounded absurd to new trainees. They were told to aim behind the visible target, to fire into empty air. Yet every ballistic equation proved it true. At 400 miles per hour, An enemy fighter crossed the sky in seconds. A 50 caliber rewired round took a third of a second to travel 300 yards, just long enough for the fighter to move far from where the gunner saw it. To hit, one had to lead the aim by several aircraft lengths, a tiny mathematical miracle calculated by instinct and repetition. The Air Forces built their entire training system around this revelation. They hired mathematicians to design mechanical, trainers, psychologists to rewrite reflexes, and even Hollywood directors to film instructional reels explaining the new science of killing. In hangars across America, young gunners stood before moving film projections of enemy planes, tracing invisible arcs of fire through the air, learning to shoot not at reality, but at prediction. Each man left training with one rule burned into his mind: don't trust your eyes, trust the math. That doctrine would be carried across the Atlantic, into the freezing skies over Europe, where men who believed it lived longer than those who didn't. But the transition from theory to survival would not be easy. For most crews, the first time they aimed behind the target wasn't in a classroom. It was under fire, when seconds meant life or death. And it was there, in the chaos above Germany, that the strange new rule began to prove itself. By mid-1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced a paradox. They had built the most heavily armed bombers in history, yet their guns were failing to protect them. The answer, commanders decided, wasn't more firepower. It was smarter firepower. That meant reinventing how men thought about shooting. At sprawling training complexes like Las Vegas Army Gunnery School, Kingman Field in Arizona, and Laredo in Texas, the military transformed education into survival. Recruits were marched into hangars filled with rotating mounts and mechanical sights aimed at moving film screens. Across those screens flickered black and white silhouettes of German fighters diving, banking, and rolling. The sound of machine. Guns rattled from hidden speakers as instructors barked over the noise. Lead your target. Fire where he's going, not where he is. This wasn't guesswork. It was physics translated into reflex. Students learned to measure deflection angles, to calculate bullet flight time, and to trust a sight picture that seemed completely wrong. The centerpiece of this revolution was the camera gunnery trainer, an early virtual reality simulator. Instead of bullets, the guns fired light through a lens that exposed a frame of film every time the trigger was pulled. After each session, the film was developed and projected for critique. Instructors could pause the reel at the moment of firing and show exactly how far off or ahead the student had aimed. It was brutal precision education, humiliation followed by enlightenment. Soon, the training became second nature. Recruits began to feel the lead rather than think about it. They learned that every burst was a conversation between time, distance, and velocity. The government even enlisted Hollywood to bring clarity to chaos. Filmmakers like Howard Hawks and technical experts from studios produced dramatic instruction films such as Flexible Gunnery, Deflection-Shooting. Animated diagrams explained bullet trajectories, while real gunners demonstrated how to aim at empty air and hit. The message was simple: physics, not passion, wins the sky. At the same time, engineers were transforming the very tools of aiming. The standard ring and bead sight, reliable on the ground, useless in the air, was replaced by optical and computing gun sights. The most famous of these was the K-14 gyro computing sight, a small mechanical brain that sensed motion and projected the correct lead point automatically. For the first time, a gunner didn't have to guess how far behind to aim. The machine did the math, and the man became its executor. This union of training and technology turned every turret into a miniature fire control laboratory. Instructors described it not as marksmanship, but as applied physics under pressure. The bullet doesn't care about your fear, one manual read. It only cares about where you told it to go. When these men graduated and boarded their B-17s, they carried that sentence with them into the war. In the cold over Germany, it became their creed. By the end of 1943, the data spoke for itself. Gunners trained under the deflection-shooting doctrine were doubling their effectiveness in combat. The average number of rounds required per confirmed kill dropped sharply. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting invisible fire, bursts that seemed to come from nowhere, killing them even as they evaded what looked like harmless misses. The phenomenon baffled them. To German eyes, the American tracers seemed consistently off target, streaking behind or beneath attacking fighters. But those were not misses. They were equations in motion, waiting for the enemy to fly into them. It was one of the rare moments in modern warfare when intellect, not aggression, decided life or death. The skies over Europe became a vast classroom where every mission tested Newton's laws in blood and fire. And slowly, through repetition and reason, America's airmen rewrote the rules of instinct itself. But the full measure of their transformation and the proof of what this new way of aiming could achieve would only be revealed in the crucible of combat. When the bombers turned toward Schweinfurt and Regensburg, they would face the deadliest gauntlet of fighters ever assembled, and the doctrine of aiming behind the target would face its first trial by fire. The science of aiming behind the target was more than a technical adjustment. It was a philosophical shift. It forced airmen to abandon instinct, rewire reaction, and redefine courage. Beneath the cold mathematics lay human tension, innovation, and sacrifice. The doctrine had many faces, and each revealed something profound about how America fought and how it learned. Every gunner who climbed into a turret carried a private war inside his head. The sky was a vacuum of sound and chaos, engines roaring, guns shaking, intercoms hissing with clipped commands. In those moments, instinct took over. The problem was that instinct in the sky was always wrong. In training, they were told again and again, "If you see him, he's already moved." Those words haunted the men during their first combat runs. It felt unnatural, even suicidal, to fire into empty air. One veteran later said, "Everything inside you fights it. Your body says aim straight. Your brain says aim wrong. You learn to listen to the wrong voice." That wrong voice saved lives. But learning it was brutal. Instructors at gunnery schools broke their students down with repetition and precision. Trainees spent hours practicing on camera guns, tracking phantom planes across endless reels of projected film, until hesitation died and muscle memory took over. By the time these men reached combat, their minds had been stripped of reflex. They didn't shoot out of emotion anymore. They shot out of prediction. The transition from fear to calculation defined them. In the waist gun or tail turret, where every second meant life or death, they had to become machines of logic, warriors who could detach from panic and trust in probability. For many, that was the hardest transformation of all. The success of aiming behind was inseparable from the rise of a new kind of technology, one that turned abstract physics into something tangible. The old ring and bead sights were artifacts of a slower world. They relied on pure eyesight and guesswork. At 400 miles per hour, those seconds of guesswork killed. The new era belonged to computing gun sights, like the K3 and later the K14 gyro sight, which predicted a target's future position by sensing the shooter's motion. These devices embodied America's wartime philosophy, that machines could enhance human instinct, not replace it. Inside the K14, tiny gyroscopes and optical mechanisms performed calculations faster than any man could think. As the gunner tracked his target, The sight automatically adjusted a floating reticle to where the bullets should go. What once required weeks of trigonometric drilling could now happen in an instant. But the technology was only half the equation. To use it effectively, the gunner had to understand why it worked. That understanding, the merging of faith and knowledge, defined the American advantage. The sight did not remove responsibility. It made precision a partnership between man and machine. The guns themselves, the Browning M2 50 caliber, were masterpieces of durability and symmetry. Mounted in overlapping fields of fire, they created a near-perfect defensive grid. When aimed correctly, their trajectories intersected at points in space calculated to shred anything flying through. Every bomber formation became a web of geometry. Every gunner a node in a larger equation. The doctrine of aiming behind the target was never meant for lone shooters. It existed to make groups of men deadly as one. The U.S. Air Forces developed the combat box, a formation so intricate that it turned entire squadrons into a moving fortress. Each bomber's guns covered the other's blind spots. Each man's field of fire overlapped with his comrades'. When an attacking fighter came in, dozens of barrels locked onto a predicted point in space. Not on the fighter itself, but on where its flight path would intersect. This meant that for the formation to work, every gunner had to trust not only his own aim, but everyone else's timing. It required discipline so tight that even a single gunner firing early could throw off the web. In the skies above Germany, this choreography unfolded like clockwork. A group of 36 bombers might unleash a combined hurricane of fire. Thousands of bullets flying through pre-calculated arcs, waiting for the enemy to arrive. To German pilots, it felt like flying into a trap that didn't exist moments before. The Americans weren't reacting to them, they were predicting them. The combination of human control, mechanical precision, and tactical synchronization turned each bomber into part of a larger organism, something both mechanical and alive. The philosophy behind aiming wrong to hit right had spread, from the individual to the collective. It wasn't just a shooting technique anymore. It was a worldview. That order could emerge from chaos if discipline and logic replaced fear and instinct. But to truly see its impact, we must shift perspectives to the men facing that fire, to the Luftwaffe pilots who suddenly found themselves dying in skies they once ruled, baffled by an enemy who seemed to see seconds into the future. The enemy's perspective. When the rules changed to the Luftwaffe, the sky over Germany had once been theirs. Their fighters, the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the rugged Focke-Wulf FW-190, had torn through Allied formations since 1940. They were faster, sharper, and flown by veterans who had survived Spain, Poland, and France. Against early American bomber crews, they seemed unstoppable. But by 1944, something invisible had changed. German pilots began reporting a strange pattern in their after-action logs. American tracers, once easily dodged, now seemed to wait for them in midair. Bursts that appeared to miss wide suddenly ripped through their wings a heartbeat later. Pilots began calling it the delayed kill. At first, Luftwaffe intelligence assumed the Americans had new radar guns or homing weapons. They sent engineers to examine recovered bombers. What they found instead were ordinary Brownings and gunners who had simply mastered time. The reports grew grim. Veterans who once dove confidently into a formation now hesitated. The attack runs that had once been suicide missions for Americans were now becoming suicide runs for Germans. The Luftwaffe's counter-tactics, diving from above, slashing through the bombers' blind spots, stopped working. No matter how fast they maneuvered, the bullets were already waiting. It was as though the Americans weren't shooting at them, but through them. In the final months of 1944, the illusion of Luftwaffe superiority dissolved completely. American bombers, once easy prey, now flew with mathematical confidence. To the enemy, it felt supernatural. as though their opponents had learned to see a second into the future. But it wasn't prophecy. It was physics, discipline, and faith in an idea that defied instinct. Behind the statistics and success was a deeper story, one of human transformation. The doctrine of aiming behind didn't just reshape tactics, it rewired the way men experienced fear. Aerial combat was a study in seconds. Fighters screamed in, guns blazing, and disappeared in less time than it took to draw breath. In that window, panic was the most natural response. Every instinct screamed to fire immediately, to fight back. But those who did, who trusted that primal reflex, almost always missed. So American gunners learned something counterhuman: restraint. They trained to breathe once before firing, to lead calmly, deliberately, even as death closed in. That sliver of patience was the line between chaos and control. It taught them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the mastery of reaction. Psychologists later found that the best gunners had lower heart rates during battle than untested recruits. They didn't freeze, they focused. They turned terror into timing. One veteran described it perfectly. It wasn't rage that saved you, it was geometry. That single phrase captured the essence of this doctrine. The moment emotion surrendered to understanding, war had forced men to become thinkers under fire. And in doing so, it blurred the old boundaries between soldier and scientist. What happened in those skies wasn't an accident. It reflected something deeply American, a national belief that knowledge could fix anything. When American commanders saw their gunners failing, they didn't double down on tradition. They called in physicists from MIT, engineers from Boeing, even film directors from Hollywood. The result was a fusion of science and storytelling. Training manuals that explained bullet trajectory with the same clarity as a movie scene. This collaborative approach, scientists, soldiers, teachers, and artists working together, became one of America's greatest wartime advantages. Where other nations relied on rigid doctrine or hierarchy, the U.S. relied on innovation. The aim-behind method wasn't just a tactic. It was the embodiment of that innovation, an idea that respected human limitation and used knowledge to overcome it. It turned courage into a system, emotion into formula, reflex into art, and beyond the war, this mindset reshaped the military itself. Engineers began to view weapons not as tools of destruction, but as problems of prediction. The future of warfare would depend not on who was braver, but on who could calculate faster. By the end of the war, the doctrine had evolved into something larger, a philosophy that transcended gunnery. The very same principle, predicting the future position of a target, became the foundation of post-war weapon design. When radar-guided fire control systems and early computer-assisted sights emerged, they were essentially mechanical versions of a trained gunner's brain. The K-14 computing sight in WWII became the ancestor of the A-1 radar sight in Korea, and later the digital lead computing systems in jet fighters. Even the first guided missiles operated on the same equation the gunners had memorized: time x velocity. Future position. The human lesson, that accuracy depended on anticipation, had been mechanized, but never lost. Every smart weapon that followed was built upon the same truth learned by those freezing men in the skies above Germany. Don't shoot where the target is. Shoot where it will be. By 1945, the Americans weren't just fighting differently. They were thinking differently. The doctrine of aiming behind had transformed warfare from a contest of nerves into a contest of intellect. But the real test of that, intellect, and the final validation of the doctrine, would come not in theory but in fire. When hundreds of bombers flew into the teeth of German airspace at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, and men had to trust invisible mathematics to keep them alive. That was where the paradox became proof. August 17, 1943. Dawn over the English countryside. The airfields of the 8th Air Force roared to life. Engines warming, propellers blurring, crews clambering aboard their bombers. That morning, more than 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from bases across East Anglia. Their target, the twin hearts of Germany's war industry, Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Regensburg built fighters. Schweinfurt built the ball bearings that made them fly. If both fell, the Reich would stumble. But to get there, the Americans would have to fly through 500 miles of enemy airspace, without fighter escort. It would become one of the bloodiest air battles in history, and the ultimate test of the new gunnery doctrine. By midday, the sky over Germany was a furnace. Hundreds of contrails twisted into spirals of smoke as the Luftwaffe struck with everything it had. Me-109s, FW-190s, and twin-engine Bf-110s, climbing and diving in coordinated waves. For the bombers, there was no retreat and no maneuver. Their only defense was mathematics. Inside the lead formation, Sergeant Thomas Whitaker manned the tail guns of his B-17. His gloves were stiff with frost, his breath freezing against his oxygen mask. The intercom crackled with warnings, "Bandits high, bandits low," until the air became nothing but voices and gunfire. Through his sight, Whitaker watched a Messerschmitt approach from below and to the left. It was climbing fast, lining up for a perfect shot at the bomber's belly. Instinct screamed, "Center him! Fire now!" But Whitaker waited. He knew what training had drilled into him. The fighters. Climb meant its trajectory would carry. It passed the crosshairs by the time his bullets reached it. He aimed where it wasn't. He fired into empty sky. Half a second later, the fighter flew into the burst. Its propeller disintegrated. The cockpit flared white, and then nothing. Whitaker didn't cheer. He just moved to the next target. Across the formation, similar moments played out in every turret. Gunners no longer reacted to what they saw. They predicted what would be. Their tracers carved invisible equations into the air. To an outside observer, it looked like chaos. To them, it was geometry, pure and ruthless. But for every German fighter falling in flames, a bomber burned too. The 8th Air Force lost 60 aircraft that day. Over 600 men killed or missing. For the crews who returned, victory felt hollow. Yet buried within the loss was revelation. Combat film and gun camera footage showed the unmistakable pattern. The highest hit probabilities came from those who applied the deflection principle exactly as trained. In other words, those who aimed behind lived longer and hit harder. Analysts at High Wycombe headquarters pored over the data. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid became a case study in precision under fire. For every bomber destroyed, 2 or 3 Luftwaffe fighters went down. Not through luck, but through anticipation. Instructors across America replayed the footage in training halls. On classroom screens, they froze frames to show the impossible truth. Tracers that appeared to miss had actually predicted. One instructor would tell his students, "What looks wrong in your eyes will look right on the film." The doctrine had passed its trial by fire. The men who returned from that mission were changed forever. They no longer questioned the rule that had once felt insane. It was now a matter of faith, mathematical faith. The Schweinfurt raid was both tragedy and turning point. The losses were catastrophic, but the results undeniable. Every report, every film, every wreck analyzed afterward confirmed it. The crews who trusted the equations shot down more planes and saved more bombers than any others. For the Air Force, this was the moment when science officially replaced instinct as the first weapon of survival. From that day on, every gunnery class in the United States began with the same film and the same sentence written across the screen. Aim wrong. Hit right. The next great test would come the following winter. over the frozen forests of the Ardennes, when the last desperate German offensive met the full power of American precision. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under snow. The trees were silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. The Germans threw everything they had left into the offensive, and the Luftwaffe, bloodied but unbroken, took to the skies one final time. Their mission: strike Allied convoys, airfields, and supply lines before the Americans could regroup. For the first time in months, the sky over Western Europe filled with German aircraft, and with them came the ghosts of the old air war. But this time, the Americans were waiting, disciplined, trained, and armed with understanding. When the clouds broke, squadrons of B-26 Marauders, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and P-47 Thunderbolts rose into the freezing air. Below them, the German armor moved through fog and forest. Above them, contrails twisted into the shape of history's final great air duel. Among the bombers was the ruthless Angel, part of the 391st Bomb Group. Tail gunner Sergeant Daniel Corbett peered through his sight at the gray horizon. His breath froze on his mask. His hands were numb. Below, tracer lines from ground fire arced upward like sparks from hell. Then came the fighters, dark shapes diving through the cloud banks, cannon flashes winking in the gloom. To Corbett, time slowed. He remembered the endless hours of simulation in Nevada, the strange lessons about future position and lead angles. Those words had felt abstract then. Now, they were the only thing standing between him and death. An ardiden fuari, readers. WWII appeared out of the mist, coming fast from below and behind. The old reflex tugged at his nerves. Center him. Fire now. But Corbett resisted. He moved his sights just off the fighter's tail, squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst, and held steady. The tracers vanished into empty sky. Then the Focke-Wulf flew into them. A burst of flame erupted along its fuselage, and the German fighter tumbled away, trailing smoke. Corbett exhaled only once the wreck disappeared into the clouds. Across the formation, hundreds of gunners were doing the same thing, firing into spaces where the enemy wasn't yet. The air became a grid of invisible intersections, every burst pre-calculated, every line of fire an act of faith. German pilots later described it with disbelief. Their fire bent time, one wrote. You evade the tracers, but they are waiting for you where you turn. It wasn't magic. It was the refinement of years of learning, the final evolution of the doctrine born in those training fields back home. During the Ardennes campaign, gun camera footage revealed something extraordinary. American gunners were hitting enemy fighters with fewer rounds than ever before. Their success rate had nearly doubled again since Schweinfurt. The reason was not improved weapons or luck. It was pure anticipation. Every angle of deflection, every mental calculation, was now instinctive. What once took conscious effort now lived in the reflexes of tens of thousands of airmen. The United States had trained an army of men who could think in motion. In less than a month, the Luftwaffe's renewed air assault collapsed. Outnumbered, outsupplied, and now outthought, they lost over 1,400 aircraft in the Battle of the Bulge alone. Entire units were wiped from the sky. The last of Germany's veteran pilots fell to gunfire that seemed to predict their every move. By January 1945, the skies belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe would never recover. Its final offensive had ended not in triumph, but in mathematical annihilation. For the Americans, this was more than victory. It was vindication. The doctrine that once sounded insane, the command to aim behind, had rewritten the rules of air combat. Every man who had trusted that logic had helped create something new. a system of warfare where intellect triumphed over instinct. When the snow finally melted and the bombers returned to base, the surviving gunners were exhausted, hollow-eyed, but changed. They had proven, once and for all, that war was not only fought with courage, it was fought with calculation. In the debriefs that followed, one statistic stood out above all. Formations that fully practiced predictive gunnery had recorded half the loss rate of those that had not. Precision had become protection. The skies over Europe were quiet now, but their lessons echoed across generations. The age of instinctive shooting was over. The age of intelligent warfare had begun, but even victory carried weight. And when the guns fell silent, those same men would have to live with the knowledge that their mastery of motion had changed not only how wars were fought, but how soldiers thought. When the war finally ended in 1945, the wreckage that littered Europe's fields and forests told the story better than any report could. Charred bombers, downed fighters, and endless shell casings lay frozen in the mud. Fragments of an invisible revolution that had unfolded in the sky. The American airmen who returned home carried with them the evidence of what disciplined understanding could achieve. In just 3 years, they had transformed from untrained farm boys to scientists of survival. They had learned to trust mathematics more than instinct, to let logic override the ancient reflex to react. At the start of the air war, they had fired 12,000 rounds for every confirmed kill. By 1945, that number had fallen below 5,000. In elite groups like the 303rd and 91st Bomb Groups, it dropped even further, sometimes below 3,000 rounds per enemy destroyed. The change wasn't in courage, nor in the weapons themselves. It was in the men behind the triggers. Post-war studies at Wright Field and Eglin Air Proving Ground revealed what no one had expected. Gunners who had undergone predictive fire training consistently outperformed those trained under older, instinctive methods, even under extreme combat pressure. Camera gun films from combat missions confirmed that nearly 80% of confirmed Luftwaffe kills were achieved using deliberate deflection shooting. It was, in essence, a victory of intellect over emotion. And yet, the transformation had come at a cost, one harder to measure in numbers. Many veterans found it difficult to unlearn the conditioning that had kept them alive. In peacetime, they noticed odd habits: overestimating motion while driving, leading moving objects by instinct, reacting to shadows as if tracking a target. The war had trained their minds to see the world in probabilities, not emotions. Some called it detachment, others discipline, but all agreed on one thing. The mental rewiring that made them so effective in the air had made ordinary life feel strangely slow, unreal. Psychologists at the time noted a phenomenon they called mechanical calm, a state in which combat-trained gunners displayed almost machine-like composure under stress, even long after returning home. They had learned to delay reaction, to override the human impulse to act, and that restraint lingered in their nerves. Yet within that calm lay pride. The gunners knew that their contribution had changed the very shape of the war. They had turned defensive fire into a science and proved that understanding, even in the chaos of battle, could be more lethal than rage. In post-war interviews, one waist gunner summarized it with haunting precision. "You stopped shooting at planes. You started shooting at where they'd be. Once you did that, you weren't guessing anymore. You were solving." It was an extraordinary confession, and a quiet testament to how war, at its most brutal, had become a test of intellect as much as endurance. The doctrine that began as a counterintuitive idea in American classrooms had saved thousands of airmen and rewritten aerial combat itself. The 8th Air Force entered the war believing courage could overcome chaos. It ended the war knowing that knowledge was the only real armor. But as the world moved toward peace, that very knowledge the ability to think faster than fear, would soon redefine warfare forever. Because the lessons learned in those gun turrets didn't end with propellers and machine guns. They would soon evolve into something far more powerful and far less human. In the years that followed the war, the doctrine that taught men to aim behind lived on, but now in circuits, radar, and silicon. The simple deflection principle that had once guided the hands of young gunners became the mathematical foundation of modern fire control systems. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, jet combat rewrote the tempo of aerial battle. Speeds had doubled. Closing velocities now approached 1,000 miles per hour. No human mind, no matter how trained, could compute lead angles fast enough. But the philosophy that had saved thousands over Germany was still there. Only now it lived inside machines, the A-1, radar gun sight, and the AN/APG-30. Computing radar system did what men had once done by feel. They predicted future position. They aimed behind automatically, guiding bullets and rockets to where the target would be. The first air-to-air missiles, primitive by today's standards, were nothing more than automated deflection calculators. The transition from flesh to circuitry was inevitable. What began as human mastery of timing had evolved into mechanical prophecy. But the irony was not lost on the men who had pioneered it. The same gunners who once held frozen grips in the bellies of bombers watched years later as their craft was replaced by guidance systems. The art of prediction had outgrown its creators. Still, every radar lock and missile intercept that followed, in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, and beyond, owed its lineage to those lessons forged above Germany. Every time a modern jet fires on a target it cannot yet see, it is echoing that same defiant logic. Don't trust your eyes. Trust the math. In the laboratories of the new U.S. Air Force, engineers memorialized that legacy in code. They studied the gun camera footage from WWII and converted the calculations into algorithms. Machines now learned what once took men months to master. The future position principle became universal. It guided anti-aircraft radar, submarine torpedoes, tank fire control systems, and even space interceptors. All obeyed the same invisible rule. Anticipate motion, predict outcome, fire before reality catches up. The language of airmen, lead, drift, deflection, turned into the language of engineers. Trajectory, vector, solution. And while it made warfare faster, deadlier, and more precise, it also made it colder. The gunners of 1944 had fought with trembling hands and human instincts fighting against fear. They had faced the paradox of killing through calm, of surviving through calculation. But their successors, guided by electronics and radar, would never experience that same contradiction. Machines could predict perfectly, but they could not feel the weight of a trigger pulled a second too soon or too late. In classrooms at Maxwell and Nellis Air Force bases, instructors reminded young pilots that technology had not replaced responsibility. Machines can lead, one lecture warned, but men still decide when to fire. That tension between man and machine, between instinct and intellect, became the moral inheritance of the WWII's gunner. Even in civilian life, the principle endured. Every modern act of prediction, from a missile trajectory to a weather forecast to a self-driving car's algorithm, follows the same truth those men once learned at 25,000 feet. The future is not guessed. It is calculated. The transition from flesh to circuitry was inevitable. What began as human mastery of timing had evolved into mechanical prophecy, but the irony was not lost on the men who had pioneered it. The same gunners who once held frozen grips in the bellies of bombers watched years later as their craft was replaced by guidance systems. The art of prediction had outgrown its creators. Still, every radar lock and missile intercept that followed, in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, and beyond, owed its lineage to those lessons forged above Germany. Every time a modern jet fires on a target it cannot yet see, it is echoing that same defiant logic. Don't trust your eyes. Trust the math. In the laboratories of the new U.S. Air Force, engineers memorialized that legacy in code. They studied the gun camera footage from WWII and converted the calculations into algorithms. Machines now learned what once took men months to master. The future position principle became universal. It guided anti-aircraft radar, submarine torpedoes, tank fire control systems, and even space interceptors. All obeyed the same invisible rule: anticipate motion, predict outcome, fire before reality catches up. The language of airmen: lead, drift, deflection, turned into the language of engineers: trajectory, vector, solution. And while it made warfare faster, deadlier, and more precise, it also made it colder. The gunners of 1944 had fought with trembling hands and human instincts fighting against fear. They had faced the paradox of killing through calm, of surviving through calculation. But their successors, guided by electronics and radar, would never experience that same contradiction. Machines could predict perfectly, but they could not feel the weight of a trigger pulled a second too soon or too late. In classrooms at Maxwell and Nellis Air Force bases, instructors reminded young pilots that technology had not replaced responsibility. Machines can lead, one lecture warned, but men still decide when to fire. That tension between man and machine, between instinct and intellect, became the moral inheritance of the WWII gunner. Even in civilian life, the principle endured. Every modern act of prediction, from a missile trajectory to a weather forecast to a self-driving car's algorithm, follows the same truth those men once learned at 25,000 feet. The future is not guessed. It is calculated. But there was a human echo that technology could never erase. When the old airmen gathered at reunions in the 1960s and 70s, they spoke not of kills or medals, but of moments, the seconds of hesitation, when their training whispered to aim away from what they saw. They remembered how unnatural it felt, how terrifying that trust had been. And yet, it had worked. The legacy of their logic outlived them. Their equations became history's new instinct. What they proved in the skies over Europe was timeless. That even in war, the most chaotic invention of mankind, the key to survival was understanding motion, not emotion, and in that quiet mastery, they had forever changed how humanity fights and how it thinks. In the vast silence that followed the Second World War, one truth lingered above all others: that the men who survived the skies had done so not because they fired faster, but because they thought further. The doctrine of aiming behind the target became more than a tactical breakthrough. It became a metaphor for human adaptability, for our ability to see past instinct, past fear, into the logic of survival. Those gunners had learned that courage wasn't always about pulling the trigger first. Sometimes it was about the discipline to wait, to act with reason when emotion demanded reaction. High above the earth, in the frozen space between seconds, they had proven that the mind could master even its own panic. That knowledge could defeat chaos. Theirs was not a story of luck or heroism, but of evolution. Humanity learning to calculate its way through mortality. Their bullets traced invisible arcs through the air, lines of probability, not rage, intersecting perfectly with the future. In every modern aircraft, missile, and guidance computer, that lesson still lives. Each algorithm that predicts, each system that calculates a moving target, carries within it the ghost of those men. The gunners who first learned to see beyond what the eye could perceive. They aimed where nothing yet existed, and found victory there. History often remembers the great generals, the strategists, and the inventors, but the true legacy of the air war belongs to those anonymous figures sealed in the bellies of bombers, trusting invisible geometry to keep them alive. Their story reminds us that war, for all its destruction, can reveal the most astonishing power of all: the ability of the human mind to outthink death itself. The men who aimed behind the target didn't just win battles, they redefined what it meant to see the future and to survive it.